So I'm just going to do a brief introduction, then I'll move a set of informal discussions that we're trying to put together with practitioners who both worked in the field for a long time, but also thought a lot about their work, have some ideas about why they're doing their work. A lot of times practitioners get so caught up in the work that they really don't have a base for what they're doing, or if they did, it was so long ago that it seemed to lose the connection between the action and the thinking or philosophy that led them to it. And I thought it was really important to try and get the thoughts of practitioners because unlike academics who take the time to write down what they're thinking, practitioners often don't, and they often have important things to say. And for me, Chuck Mathei has been a real influence on my own thinking, so it's particularly important for me to have this chance to interview you, ask you some questions in an informal way. I mean, what I've drawn up is what I sent you, and my notes are about half a page, you can see, which are essentially those questions. So I see this really as an informal, free-flowing sort of discussion where I can ask you a general question, allow you to talk about it, ask follow-up questions that really gets to things about why are you doing this work, who do you see as influences, what's your basic philosophy that underlines the work that you're doing, and to talk a little bit about future vision in the context of some of the social and political factors that are affecting development today, both in the United States and beyond. So that's really the point of this interview, and I'm really looking forward to it. It's actually something I've thought about doing for a long time, and have finally gotten together. So I'm also glad that you're willing to do this on a nice, hot summer July afternoon in Connecticut, where it's probably close to 90 degrees in here. So that's what we're going to do today.
Well, since you've been a significant influence in my work and thinking, we should treat it as a conversation. And I'll invite you to share your thoughts as we go back and forth.
All right. Well, we'll do that. I'm going to move.
Michael, a recent surgery has affected my voice in a way that doesn't hurt to speak, but it may make it more difficult for you to understand me. So if you have difficulty, say so, and we'll try again.
Okay. Well, right now it's pretty good. So.
It may change.
All right. Chuck, let me start by asking a little bit about your background. How did you initially get into the field of community development, social change, social justice? I mean, I know that you grew up in Chicago. It's not necessarily anything that, as far as what I know from you, that came from direct family living, so there must have been other influences. Can you talk a little bit about what got you interested in this type of work?
Well, I did grow up in a largely Republican, conservative, suburban community of Chicago, and was always interested, even as a child, in civic affairs. In fact, I helped to organize a team of young volunteers for Donald Rumsfeld's first congressional campaign. None of us were old enough to vote, but we were old enough to pass out flyers. And I proceeded along those lines of thought as a child until the civil rights movement of the mid-60s affected my view of the world and my place in it. And I suppose if you had to look at a beginning point, it would be the civil rights movement of the 60s. And that certainly helped to awaken me not only to issues of justice and injustice, but certainly to the discrepancies of wealth and poverty. And I made some personal decisions in those last years of high school. One was not to go to college, because I'd found the high school that I went to not very receptive to the social concerns that had come to dominate my thinking in those years. And it was such a time of drama and upheaval, a time of choice. It was a time when there was a challenge that history was presenting to the community at large, to the country at large. It was a time to make decisions and make commitments.
What year was this? What year did you finish high school?
I finished high school in 1966, but it was 1964 that was the pivotal year for me. I actually spent the summer at the University of Texas on a special science program for high school students. But 1964 was also Mississippi Freedom Summer, and it was the occasion of a major presidential campaign in which many of these issues were starkly framed. And it was in the course of that summer that my thinking changed. So I came back to Illinois, where I grew up, from Texas, having made some very dramatic changes in my areas of interest and activity. And those next 2 years, the last 2 years of high school, were years that were dominated not by coursework, which had absorbed me in the first 2 years, but by my growing involvement with first the civil rights movement, and then of course those were also the years in which the major escalation of the U.S. war in Vietnam took place, and I was approaching 18 in draft age, and one thing led to another. But in both of those arenas, both the civil rights arena and the emerging peace movement, I found myself encountering figures and traditions like Gandhi and the philosophy of nonviolence, which is really so much more encompassing as he understood it and explained it and advocated it than most Americans realize. You know, we tend to think of nonviolence in terms of physical violence, of war and peace, or personal conflict. In fact, Gandhi set out a philosophy that saw social change as having three very distinct and necessarily related elements. It began with the personal commitment and character, the integrity and active involvement of the individual. He said, in effect, no movement can ultimately be better or more lasting than the character and commitment of the people who constitute that movement. So the personal commitment was the first leg of this triangle. The second dimension was what he called a constructive program, and what we could call community economic development. It wasn't sufficient simply for individuals to act alone, but neither was a political process in the more traditional sense adequate. He saw the constructive program or the community development program as being absolutely integral to the process of social change for several reasons. One, it responded to real needs that were immediate. People were suffering and their needs had to be met. But secondly, by meeting those needs, and he organized any number of village development initiatives and organizations. They sent literally thousands of volunteers into villages all over India. By doing that, by responding to people in their homes, in their villages, and in the daily tasks and needs of their lives, you build loyalty and trust and allegiance. So you're building a constituency, ultimately, for the more political initiatives when they come. And you're also perfecting the skills that you would need if you win those political battles. So you launch a political campaign and you succeed. Now you have the responsibility to make use of the opportunity that you've won. And the process of community development, the constructive program, would give both the villagers but also the practitioners, their advocates, their friends and allies, the skills that would be needed to realize that opportunity. So you have those three elements: personal commitment, the constructive program, and ultimately the political process.
Now this is work that you became familiar with in high school, the end of high school. How did you...
It was thinking, a way of looking at the process of social change, and an understanding that community development, though I wasn't calling it that at that point, but it gave me the basis of understanding the importance of community development as an expression of personal values, but also as a necessary precondition for a larger process of social change.
And how did that affect you personally? I mean, you read this, but at an age where really you're still a kid in a way, and most kids are thinking about what am I going to do with my life, or which college should I go to, or where do I find a job? I mean, how do you translate these, for a middle class American? How do you translate this theory into one of practical action? I'm curious to know what was that step between knowing something and actually using that knowledge to make personal choices about what you do with your life.
Initially, those personal commitments were expressed more in the context of what we would call social service than social change or community development. And I think, like most Americans, I didn't appreciate adequately the difference between service and change, service and development. I had been through church and civic organizations even at a younger age, even before my political perspectives changed. I had been involved in any number of traditional social service initiatives, whether it was collecting emergency supplies for people in need, or tutoring children in inadequate school systems, or in other ways trying to respond to human needs in the community. As I approached the end of high school and realized that continuing in an academic context would be not likely to give me enough opportunity to pursue these other interests, I heard about the VISTA program, which in those days, its early days, was structured very much like a domestic Peace Corps, where volunteers would be brought together for an initial training and then sent out to different parts of the country for a period of community service. So I thought to myself, well, instead of going to college, I'll sign up for VISTA, and maybe I'll go to the mountains of Kentucky and serve the poor. Well, as it turned out, VISTA strung me along for a period of time through an application process, and then when it looked like everything was ready to move forward, they sent a telegram and said, we're eager to have you, but you're just a little bit young. Why don't you wait 6 months? Well, combination of the impatience of youth and growing tension with my family over some of my political views and involvements made me feel that I had to move more quickly. So without any other apparent opportunities, no other established avenues that I was aware of, though I'm sure they were out there, or any number of other volunteer programs or opportunities, but I didn't know where they were or how to find them. One day, on my way to work at a psychiatric hospital where I was an orderly, it struck me that it was time to move on. So 2 weeks later, on a Honda 50, a small motorbike, at about 30 miles an hour, its maximum speed, I left the suburbs of Chicago, going somewhere for the rest of my life, with a clear sense of what was important to me, but no idea how to pursue it. And I landed first in a log cabin in the mountains of northern Vermont, about 10 miles from the Canadian border. And that was not an immediate opportunity to involve myself in community development, but it was a lesson in community. This was the old New England village, before interstates and ski resorts and commercial development so altered the character of rural life in America. So spending that first block of time in the old New England village, where neighbors helped neighbors in truly remarkable ways, where the old Currier and Ives prints were a virtual reality, did teach me a good bit about the values of community as they could be manifested in the lives of people in an environment like that. But while I was there, I also received notice from the draft board that they were prepared to enlist me and send me to Vietnam. And I had previously registered my conviction as a conscientious objector. They ignored that or rejected that claim and pursued the draft process. I appealed the classification, but then thought more about it and realized that my objection was certainly to war, But more than that, it was also toward conscription itself, to compulsory labor, which I felt undermined and contradicted the true spirit of service. Service is not something that we're compelled to offer one another. It's something we're moved to give, something we owe to one another because so much has been given to us. And so I renounced the claim and withdrew my participation from the selective service system. And I was eager to find other people who had similar convictions.
What do you mean by withdrew your participation in selective service?
I notified the draft board that I would refuse any orders. I would refuse to appear for a physical. I would refuse induction into the Army and refuse military service, and furthermore would refuse compulsory voluntary non-military service. That I would try to live a life of service, but I would do it as an expression of gratitude for the life that I had been given, not as a response to a military order. And so I was facing the prospect of criminal prosecution for violating the draft laws, and I was eager to find others who had similar convictions and were similar circumstances. And in a roundabout way, that led me to the Catholic worker movement, which was established in the early 1930s by Dorothy Day, a convert to Catholicism, who had a background in the political and social change movements of the 20s and before, and Peter Morin, a French peasant, an immigrant from France, whom Dorothy had met, and whose program of culture and cultivation in some ways mirrors those Gandhian principles of personal commitment, community development, and political action for social change. Dorothy found herself persuaded by Peter's thinking, and together they launched the Catholic worker movement to try to bring those social values to the Catholic community of which they were a part, but they were never limited in their associations or their allegiances to the Catholic community. This was not an agency of the church. It was a movement of people who were inspired by a set of values that certainly can be found in Catholic tradition and social teaching, but can be found in many other religious and secular traditions as well. But the Catholic worker did combine, and does combine, an ongoing commitment to service on the one hand and to social change on the other. And so Catholic worker houses of hospitality had grown up throughout the country and beyond this country. They might involve soup kitchens and emergency shelters, and some of them specialized, work with children or families or later homeless people with AIDS. But it was a commitment of personal responsibility for the needs of others, personal response to the needs of others. So again, it was rooted in the personal commitment, but as people came together in these Catholic worker communities, they then responded collectively to the needs of their neighborhoods, and those personal and collective commitments were the foundation for an ongoing involvement in the labor struggles of the 30s, the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s, the peace movement of the 60s and 70s, always an expression of these values of personal responsibility.
So you went to live in one of these houses?
Right.
And how old were you at that time?
18, yeah.
And where did you go to, New York?
To New York initially, and then I moved on and maintained always a kind of spiritual home base with that tradition, though I wasn't personally raised in a Catholic family. But it has been a kind of a spiritual home, and in part because it does manifest that integrated perspective. Initially, again, the work was what we're accustomed to as direct service, social service, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, shelter the homeless, the works of mercy, just put it in Catholic terms. But through my association with Dorothy and others, I began to realize that the problem of poverty is not as simple as it seems, and that the issue is not simply income, but it's ownership. The issue is not simply how much flows into a community, but how fast it flows back out. And that's a product not of income insufficiency, but of structures of ownership that drain assets and earnings right out of the communities that have created them.
You've often said that to understand poverty, you have to understand wealth as well.
Right.
What do you mean by that?
I think the central question is, what is the origin of value? Right? I mean, there are two questions that frame our understanding of property, for instance. And I'm kind of intrigued in a casual way with etymology or the origin of words. Property as a word has a relationship, an historical relationship to propriety, which suggests righteousness or has a different connotation than simply the material connotation of property. Likewise, the word equity, which we've embraced in the name of the nonprofit organization with which I'm now associated. Equity is, on the one hand, a financial interest in property. On the other hand, it's a moral principle of fairness. But if you think about this issue of property, which intrigues me, it's certainly one of the basic elements of economics. Property can be understood, ownership can be understood as both equity and control. And the question is, what gives rise to a claim of ownership? By what right do I exert control, claim ownership, possess property? That's one question. The second question, the financial dimension, is where does value come from? And what makes it change over time? And if you ask that question, where does value come from? Of course, we realize that it comes in part from the effort of an individual, but in part it comes from actions which an entire community takes.
What's an example of that?
A group of low-income people in a distressed and dilapidated neighborhood decide to be good citizens for their own sake and the sake of their neighbors, for the sake of their children. And they're going to institute a crime watch, or clean up the vacant lots, or improve the buildings in which they live, make the place a little better, nicer, safer place to live. Anything that they do to improve the quality of life is going to enhance the desirability of that neighborhood and predictably increase its property values. The problem, of course, is if they have no ownership interest in that property, not only will they perhaps, not only will they not benefit financially from the initiatives they've taken, they may inadvertently unleash or contribute to a process of gentrification that will ensure that they're not even there in the final analysis to enjoy the fruits of their labor. Or put in a different context, I remember picking up the Washington Post one day and seeing an announcement that a new subway line would be put through Anacostia, one of the poorest neighborhoods in the United States. Well, predictably, as soon as it becomes known where the subway stations will be, and you can be sure that there are many commercial interests or developers or speculators in the city who've got that information long before it appeared on the front page of the Post. But as soon as it becomes known where those stations will be, the obvious benefit of access to mass transportation will impact property values surrounding those stations. So the taxpayers, who are largely responsible for creating that subway system, because it'll be mostly federal dollars that pays for it, taxpayers all over the country will pay to build these subway stations. As a result, certain groups of properties will rise dramatically in value, but all of the benefit of that increase will come to the owner of record. And the people, the low-income people, for the most part, the tenants in those buildings in Anacostia, will actually be disadvantaged by the rising prices that will drive up rents. And if they can't pay those rents, then one of two things must happen. Either they'll have to have subsidies from the same taxpayers who paid for the subway station, or they'll be displaced. They'll suffer the consequences of displacement, and again, likely the same taxpayers will be asked to subsidize their relocation. So when I talk about wealth, we have to ask ourselves where value comes from. And we have to ask ourselves then, what is an appropriate allocation of that value? I don't think there's any such thing as unearned income, for example. You could glibly but seriously call unearned income income that one person or community has earned but another one has taken. The question is, what's the origin of value and how do we allocate it equitably according to its source?
Well, a couple of questions with respect to that. I know in a lot of the work that you've done, you've tried to address the question of how do you balance individual interests versus community interests.
Right.
In both a political sense but also an economic sense. And it really is related to this issue of
Right.
unearned income, for example. But I know in a lot of your thinking, and I believe this as well, that in the United States today and in the economy and society we live in, that we've bent a little too far to the individual interests without recognizing how to balance those with community interests. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking about how individual interests can be effectively balanced with community interests, and how work that you've done has attempted to do that both theoretically and practically?
Well, the balance between individual and community interests has been, the bread and butter, the constant theme of my thinking and my work. I think in this country, we've to a large extent lost sight of the community as a body, as an economic actor. So we're very aware of the individual, and we live in a culture which celebrates and elevates the individual, mythologizes the individual. The notion, for example, of the private sector is something of a fiction. You find a significant industrial or commercial initiative in any city that develops today without some kind of direct or indirect government subsidy, whether it's tax incentives or tax relief or direct subsidy grants or infrastructure contributions or whatever. There's no such thing as an entirely private economy, though much of our political discourse proceeds as if there were, or as if the only economic actor of note is the individual. But when you look, as we have it, at the individual in community, which is the only way that in any other dimension of our lives we can understand ourselves biologically, socially, spiritually, psychologically, we don't live alone. No man is an island is the old adage, we understand that individuals come from a community. They're part of a community. But as American society has evolved, particularly with the affluence and the mobility that came after World War II, many of the traditional relationships and structures of society have broken down, And I think one of the great tragedies of American politics in the last generation is that we allowed the difficulties, the social problems that so many people faced to be captured, in a sense, by right-wing political forces, as if they were the result of left-wing initiatives or thinking. What happened really is that as mobility and affluence changed the circumstances of people's lives, and as the commercial and corporate interest evolved over time, we saw traditional units of society break apart. And we went from the village to the extended family to the nuclear family, as for a period of time our understanding of the fundamental building block of society. Never before in human history has a nuclear family been asked to be the foundation of a society. There had been tribes, villages, communities, extended families, nuclear families, and individuals, but the nuclear family had never been asked in human experience to be the cornerstone. And when it was put in that position, it began to break apart. It simply isn't strong enough. The individual has to live within those concentric circles of community. and we have to understand that the individual has distinctness and integrity, deserves respect, and is an economic actor. But each of those communities and each of those layers of community also represents a body, a being, with integrity, with purpose, with initiative, and an economic actor that deserves respect and has a legitimate economic interest. And so the question is, how do you acknowledge and balance the legitimate interests of the individual with the interests of the community over time?
And how have you addressed that question?
Well, we've looked for economic models or structures or tried to create them that respected both the individual and the community. So we work with a model like the Community Land Trust, which is neither public nor private, individual or collective in singular terms. It's not one or the other, it's something of both. It recognizes that individuals take initiative and deserve equity, but it also recognizes that the community, in a variety of ways, contributes to value, and that value should be recognized, protected, and preserved, and made available to serve that community over time. So you're always trying to serve the individual, the community. You could add the wildlife, the plant life, the natural environment, and the next generation.
When you